and then I will pass it off to you guys. Take it away.
Well, thank you so much. Amy and I always appreciate the opportunity to speak a bit about AI. Personally, I can't speak for her, but I am very much an advocate of it. I'm a converted member of the faithful, I guess you could say. When I first heard about it, I was terrified of it, but I had one question at our research desk that I understood no part of. It was multifaceted and had understood no parts. And within 30 seconds, it explained each section to me and how they fit together so I could actually research it. When I saw those possibilities, I became a bit of an advocate, but I'm not here to promote it today. I'm just talking about how we should probably use it. Amy?
I don't use it as often as Brandon does, and to be completely transparent, this is the only title that we came up with on our own that was not AI generated, so for whatever that's worth. But it was really interesting to look at some of these things, hopefully through the lens of what would be most relevant to you guys working in archival stuff.
Yeah, and as an overview, neither of us are archivists. Amy might have worked as a student worker at one point, but I have no background in it, so I'm not going to presume how this necessarily applies to you. There are a couple of things that I will or we will introduce that talk about concerns and concepts that certainly do apply to archivists, and in a global sense, a lot of these. But I just don't want you to think that I'm saying, okay, this is how you should use it in your job and how you should not. We're going to talk about our experiences dealing with students and just how it relates to research, academic work, and then maybe let you bridge some of those gaps as we go, because again, I don't want to presume familiarity. So a little bit more about this presentation. AI is no longer theoretical in our work. Students are using it, faculty are experimenting with it, vendors are building it into tools. It's already here. Like I said, I was terrified when I first heard about it. But the acceleration of it is new. It is. I mean, even before I heard of it, like post pandemic, it had been around, but it's picking up. It has new applications every day, and with those applications come concerns, obviously. So the speed's different. Technology and the expectations around it are moving very quickly. Accountability is not though. The questions about authorship, attribution, and trust are things librarians and archivists have always dealt with, but the medium's changed a little bit. One thing to keep in mind, this is not a product demo. As I said before this session, I've been kind of moving away from demonstrating necessarily tools and talking more about research concepts. That's more of what we're going to be doing here today. So we're not here to show tools, and it's certainly, even though we talk about the ethical parts of it, it's not a denunciation of using AI. We just want to simply have folks think through how these systems interact with responsibilities that we already carry.
So really briefly, if you don't mind answering a couple questions on Mentimeter, should work through either the QR code provided or the numerical code at the bottom. But let me know if you're having troubles connecting. We're just asking 3 questions to hopefully get some insight into what you guys think.
Just let me know when you want to go over to the other window, because I'm actually going to have to switch windows to advance it.
Yeah, maybe wait another second to make sure everybody got the code.
I'm not rushing.
We're getting responses, so if you want to go ahead.
Okay. Let's see. And let me move over.
And theoretically, this should work and show our responses in real time.
Okay. So.
No, go back, Brandon.
Okay. There you go. Sorry.
And we asked this in a vague sense on purpose. So whatever you want to share here. Environmental inaccuracy concerns, incorrect information, crediting authorship. Oh, that's interesting. I can see more on my screen. That people will become reliant on it and it may prove to be environmentally unsustainable.
Do you want me to
lack
go?
of ownership of created items.
I can
Okay.
advance and go back if you want to see if it updates.
Yeah, see if it,
Yep, there you go.
thank you for your answers. I'll go into the second question. How often do you use AI tools professionally?
There we go. You see it okay?
Yep.
Okay.
Okay, so the only difference is a few more and not often or not yet. And then one last question here. And it'll do a word cloud, so just be brief. But how do you use AI tools?
I'll have to do that a few times.
Ooh, graphic design. Inscription, I could see where that would be very helpful.
More time.
Thank you guys for participating. We just wanted to get a little bit of information from you guys as an audience too, instead of just talking at you. But that's all you have to do with the mini.
Because again, we're not archivists, so it kind of gives us a bit of insight into the concern. Well, I mean, we could guess at kind of things that you would be interested in. So, clarifies that a bit. Okay, so let's move on. Everybody see the next slide? Lots of little pictures.
Yep.
Okay. I grabbed some controversial AI headlines, mostly from the last year, but some of them are a little bit different. But we often talk about AI in abstract terms, things like capability, disruption, innovation. Of course, those things all play a part in such an, I'm not saying amazing, you sound like a cheerleader, such a tool with so much potential. But the real issues that are around aren't abstract. They're showing up in headlines, lawsuits, licensing agreements, and even in our energy agreements, which Amy will be talking about later. Each one of these things listed here, one of those issues, is where things get complicated. The first one, you'll see authority. This is something one of my colleagues told me about last year. It's a pretty embarrassing thing for the Chicago Sun-Times. They always do a summer book guide. And it ended up being entirely AI generated, and more than a few of the books on the list didn't exist. So that was a bit of embarrassment for them. So what does that get to? When AI generated material circulates without disclosure, the question isn't just accuracy, which is obviously a big question, but also legitimacy. And we'll get into that a little bit more later as to what's legitimate and how disclosure plays a part. And it can kind of be a double-edged sword, honestly. Authorship. If in this case it's Scarlett Johansson is suing OpenAI. If I remember the case correctly, gentleman that runs OpenAI, I think his name's Sam. I can't remember his last name. Sorry, but he had asked for the permission to use her voice several times, and she denied it. So they basically, I don't want to sound judgmental, but they borrowed it. We'll say that without her consent. And if a voice can be replicated without consent, attribution as to what it begins to wobble a bit. Who's the person that's actually speaking? If you use her voice, these concerns go well beyond starlets and their voice. It goes into thought. It goes into, images. What's real? What's not? But how do you retain authorship? Who is the author? Privacy concerns. You'll see here that Amazon's Ring is now using facial recognition, which is a bit controversial, something that certainly bothers me. Always, if I sit on the front porch, put a t-shirt over it, thing. But systems can now combine data in ways that make people identifiable, and that's a bit scary. No, not because something new has been published, but because inference, has become easier. The machines make the connections that weren't always made, or the systems.
We had we taught a co-ed class last semester where we integrated AI tools in a lot of our assignments. And one of the hypotheticals we asked students is if they would think it was okay if campuses used AI recognition, even if there was like a 30% inaccurate rate of detection, or like possibly saying it was someone else. And they all said, yeah, it was fine, which is kind of scary.
They also thought it should be used to basically like a lie detector and be admissible in court. That one bothered me more, but both of those were very concerning.
Yeah.
I mean, to step on you there. Go ahead.
That was all.
Okay. Environment. AI runs on infrastructure, data centers, hardware, energy, and energy is certainly a big thing, as Amy will talk about. Ownership. She actually talks about this study in a minute. Ownership. Scholarly work is already being licensed to AI for AI. In this particular case, you'll see academic authors shocked after Taylor and Francis basically sold their research to Microsoft AI. It raises familiar archival questions: who controls the value of reported knowledge? And then finally, one of my favorite words, freedom. There are going to be some First Amendment fights as to what's allowable with AI legally. And there are going to be regulation debates beginning, like they've already begun, but they'll obviously start to multiply. None of these questions are necessarily new to our professions. Archivists and librarians, they've always worked, between access, protection, authority, and interpretation. But what feels new is how quickly these issues appear and how often they're triggered by systems rather than people. Again, this will be a theme, but responsibility hasn't disappeared. It's just not as clearly as assigned as it is. So, framing question: ethical inquiry into AI's roles. Where does responsibility sit? If AI participates in creating knowledge, work is still accountable to someone. That's. I don't think anybody would argue that. As it says here, the harder question is who is actually making the decision. To the point here, when AI contributes to knowledge, responsibility doesn't become abstract. It helps draft a guide, catalog a record, a policy, a finding aid. That work is still accountable to someone. Someone is still responsible for the accuracy of it. Someone mentioned accuracy. Several people mentioned accuracy as a concern there. It is a major. Even in my own work, it's one of those things you have to double and triple check everything it suggests, and then sometimes go back and do it another time. The harder part is figuring out where judgment is actually happening. Is the person prompting? Is the person approving? Is the institution deploying it? Or does it get spread thin enough that no one fully feels it? That's kind of the tension or kind of the dynamic, and that's kind of where we want to start. To that point, this is our little disclaimer. AI assisted in parts of this presentation. Human judgment guided it. It's one of those things, we'll get into it more, but with student papers, you always worry with students, they're just going to say, write me a paper on this subject. But even if you're using it and using it ethically and using it a lot, it can save time, certainly. But if you're conscientious about it, I find it allows me to think more creatively, allows me to consider other things that I wouldn't be considering when I just have to have a presentation out or something like that. It can speed things up, but it allows me to have greater considerations. But to this point, we certainly used AI on this. You'll see some of the images will be AI generated, and then some other parts of it as well. So going to the authorship and intellectual agency, when the author is not alone. That's what I was just talking about. When we talk about AI, we talk about tools. What's really shifting is the authorship there. Increasingly, writing and thinking are happening with a system sitting beside us. It acts in many ways, but it's our sounding board. It's our brainstorming buddy. So the question becomes simple. If the author isn't alone anymore, where does the responsibility sit? And that's a pretty big question. Where things go wrong, and I'll show a little bit of research on this in a moment, is in these areas: transparency, delegation, abdication, and automation bias. Transparency is not confession; it's traceability. How you can go back and see. Readers should be able to understand how ideas were formed. If AI shapes things like language structure or synthesis, that influence obviously matters. The question is not, did you use AI? The question is, can we clearly identify which human judgment operated there? What part was the human playing in it? Were they driving the car or were they along for the ride? Without clarity of contribution, accountability weakens in that case. Delegation and abdication. Delegation, basically responsible use. Delegation itself is not the issue. It's certainly not the issue. Using AI is not the issue. Efficiency does not transfer responsibility, though. The responsibility is still on you, even though the tool allows you to be more efficient. Human still has the judgment. They're still, again, driving the car. You just don't want to surrender oversight, and that's what happens so many times, and often happens, I would presume, with students. We had very ethical students in our study. I still wonder about that. But we did our best to make sure that it was anonymous, but they were very, very ethical. But abdication begins when review and questioning stop. It has to be an ongoing process, much like writing or research is anyway. It's not just a linear progress. There's back and forth, both in terms of time, in terms of progress, in terms of consideration. And if we defer critical oversight to the system, that's when our responsibility starts to wane. It becomes hollow. Our name on the work is not exactly the same as exercising judgment. You can slap your name on anything. You still have responsibility for that, but it's not exercising judgment. So again, the goal is not to avoid AI, it's to maintain our intellectual agency, make sure we're the ones driving the car. Automation bias is the last one there. You don't want to over-rely on AI. Fluency in that's a big thing with AI. Fluency is not accuracy. It can make you convinced that it is an expert on something. There is no doubt. And like when I'm speaking, you'll hear me. I'm a nervous person anyway. You'll hear some doubt in my voice sometimes, but AI does not have that doubt there. It will speak as if it is correct on everything, and it's correct enough that people probably do rely on it. So you have to keep that in mind. Fluency is not accuracy. When something sounds polished, we as humans tend to stop questioning it. Automation bias shows up when we accept the outputs without slowing down. Again, in a rush, trying to crank something out. Some people can say, well, the AI can do it for me. I don't have to spend time on it. I can do whatever. No, you actually have to work through each step. In research and archival work, that shortcut can, erode rigor. It can erode work habits. It can erode engagement. And again, the authority that it gives is often an illusion. It generates confident prose. It's not, but confidence is not competence. We can mistake its coherence for credibility. So it's not that AI speaks to us; it's that it sounds certain. So we have to interrogate it at every part. We have to show critical evaluation. We don't need to be afraid of it, but we need to make sure that we're pumping the brakes on. I'm sorry for the car metaphors, but we're pumping the brakes when needed. That's something to keep in mind. I'll move forward so Amy has time to speak. But looking at transparency again, these are a couple of studies that I found. It wasn't an extensive lit review, but I found some interesting things. One thing, major journals now require disclosure of AI assistants. You can see Nature down there. That's from a section where they talk about the rules related to AI. AI systems are not recognized as authors under current authorship standards in most cases. I know the APA has done it. There's a lot of different organizations that have done it at this point, a lot of different publications. But then you go into the other two bullet points, which relate to the other two studies there. Experimental research indicates that perceived AI authorship can influence credibility judgments. So that's pretty interesting. in this particular study, the one by Purcell there, people have different expectations versus for their own versus others. In that particular case, the participants assumed that their own use would be responsible, but others would misuse it. And if that's not the human condition, I don't know what it is. I'm not the bad guy. I'm not the irresponsible person. Everyone else is, you know. So that gap in expectations is one reason transparency has become so important. But it can be a double-edged sword. Sometimes perceived authorship, it's going to be shaped by credibility, even when the content is identical. But on the other hand, as I pointed out there with Schilke, transparency reinforces accountability, but it can affect trust. And the trust is shaped by social norms, not just honesty. Disclosure can protect accountability. That's clear, but trust is not purely rational. In the Schilke study, they showed that when people disclosed that they'd used AI, people were more prone to look at it critically, to have a negative, basically negative associations. Moving on to delegation and abdication. Again, to when we give up the steering wheel. In this particular study, cited down at the bottom in Radke, it was 303 learners in Germany. They want to examine whether authorship labeling affects how learners revise academic texts. The researchers were not testing whether AI is bad or good. They're isolating the effect of perceived authorships. The participants revised 2 academic texts. That's what they're asked to do in it. One was labeled as peer written, one was labeled as AI generated. And it's a funny thing, when students believed the text was AI generated, they spent significantly less time revising it. There were not necessarily fewer revisions, but less time was put into engaging in it. And that label obviously changed the way they looked at it. And it wasn't neutral. Students who trusted AI more revised less. And then this is the term they used in the study, but those prone to loafing revised even less than that. So it isn't just about a tool, it's about our disposition and how we interact. And the important part is more in the study, more experienced writers, regardless of the label, identified more problems and made more substantive revisions. That's probably natural in general, but it also shows how information literacy is so important. And experiences seem to buffer the effect of what was going on there. Again, AI isn't necessarily the problem. Delegation isn't necessarily the problem. Being disengaged is the problem, and that's where the abdication part creeps in. Automation bias. Obviously, we don't want to over-rely. We'll stop checking then. Authority, illusion. We trust tone. Getting into what I just said, and then critical evaluation. Oversight is not clicking approve. You've got to look at it before you click approve. You have to make sure it represents you and make sure it represents your universe. I guess I should talk about the study. But yeah, this was actually a study done in 2016. It was way before AI became a prominent thing. But what it found out was that when people use systems, there was over-reliance on the system. It doesn't mean people are lazy. It just means the systems reduce cognitive friction. Again, things are easier, so you're hitting the accelerator. So when output appears coherent and immediate, the impulse to verify weakens. That's a big thing to take from that. And there's an illusion of authority. That's also something I've been getting at, obviously.
And then we see this a lot, even when we're doing database searches with students. All of the integrated AI tools and things may or may not be accurate and helpful. So just teaching like higher level critical thinking and for students to kind of know what those separate pieces are. In our survey, the overarching response from students was wanting more transparency from their professors, wanting more direction and for everyone, whether they were pro or kind of against AI use. But it's here and it is pretty integrated in a lot of different tools that we have to use anyways. So even if they're trying to avoid using specific tools, it can be challenging to not just read those summaries as fact.
These are a couple examples of basically slides I used this semester so far. In a Psych 8001 class, you'll see in the bottom right, I don't know if I'm starting that way, but I'm starting that way. I framed it more of scenarios, what they could defend related to their thesis. In this particular case, you ask an AI tool to explain how psychologists typically conceptualize burnout so you can refine the search terms. Is that defensible for the thesis? Why or why not? And then some of these, it really got them thinking, and it seemed to really engage them. But again, that's graduate students. They're going for a higher degree. They're going to be more naturally engaged. For undergraduates, this is a social work class I did. This isn't copyrighted or anything, but the main thing is I put it in some positive ways you can do it. It could possibly be used as a theory matchmaker, breaking down policy to some degree, as long as you double check it. And then possibly, if you're looking at claims you make, how would other people counter argue that? That's something you can look at. And then I put in these things that you have to do. You have to use it to assist you, not to lead you. Audit it, double check everything, and then make sure you don't lose your identity. So yeah, this is a question for you all. If automation shortens engagement in writing, does it also shorten deliberation and appraisal or description? I'll let you reflect on it. We can leave it then. I've talked too much. So just as to sum up my part here at the beginning, reflecting on agency, AI can assist. It cannot assume accountability. Ultimately, you're the responsible party. Judgment can't be automated. You have to maintain, it has to be a human element in there. And that's where the humans come in. We exercise the judgment because, again, it sounds like it's an expert on something, but it will put things in that are entirely wrong. See it if you pay attention at all. And then smarter tools do not reduce human responsibility; they increase it. We have an obligation again, so the tool scales, but the obligation does as
well. Brandon, can you go back to that question one more time?
yes,
I'm gonna drop it in the chat so that as you guys move forward, in case anybody wants to respond to that while we're going. I'm so sorry for interrupting.
No worries. I should have gave more time to it, but I've been talking so much.
No, that's okay. That's okay. That's what you're here for.
Tend to do too much. All right, Amy.
So we briefly talked about system level costs related to AI as well. Although I could have kept going and going and going, but you go to the next slide. This was me guessing in general terms too, because we are not archivists. But I did find the three kind of main categories of environmental threats that archivists have to reckon with, in positive ways that AI tools can help address those things, like climate control, pest management, and the passage of time. I don't know how widely used these are. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the specific tools that I found. And I'm sure there are other versions of these things too. But a lot of the content I found was about looking at existing data to establish patterns, to be more specific with strategic sustainability plans and disaster plans, based on historical data, monitoring and logging some of those things that affect archives like temperature, humidity, and forecasting routine maintenance needs. So just integrating some of those things into a tool does seem like it could definitely be helpful and useful. Similar kind of application with pest management, analyzing population trends, predicting spread, anticipating service needs based on past things or similar environments. And then the passage of time, most of the information I found was talking about the importance of digitizing content for perpetuity. But these different tools for data extraction, automatic metadata, transcription tools, especially with handwriting samples and maybe oral histories as well, where those could be definitely helpful. Cloud-based document storage methods too. But making virtual repositories more accessible for more people for a longer amount of time. Yeah, so those were kind of the three big overarching themes I saw and how AI could potentially be useful in each of those applications. AI is very environmentally fraught though, where as there's a higher energy consumption directly related to building these data centers, training these data centers, an increase in water pollution, an increase in fossil fuel use. I liked the quote at the end in one of the articles I said, I found said existing approaches to deploying and managing AI computing often exacerbate environmental inequities. So not only are they damaging to the environment in a myriad of ways, but as is, they're just making that problem worse in the existing way. So it's definitely something that needs to be addressed in a way to make AI use more sustainable for everyone, as it is integrated in so many different things. But these are just some of the examples of contributing to its carbon footprint.
Sorry.
And then these are some of the charts I found related. But Gartner analysts estimate worldwide data center electricity consumption will rise from 448 terawatt hours in 2025 to 980 by 2030. In 2025, AI optimized servers are projected to represent 21% of total center power usage and up to 44% by 2030. So it's a pretty significant jump there. By 2030, they will represent 64% of the incremental power demand for data centers. So a very significant jump in electricity usage. I read another study too, where it was talking about the difference in strain on environmental concerns, like in Finland versus Asian countries. And that was kind of speaking to how AI use on a really wide scale is just exacerbating those existing environmental inequities. And then this article was saying electricity consumption at a US data centers is expected to more than double by 2030. So that was the end of last year that came out. So that increase works out to more than 4% of the country's total electricity consumption last year, roughly equivalent to the annual electricity demand of the entire nation of Pakistan, which is crazy. And then the figure's projected to grow by 133% by 2030. We also wanted to mention bias and distortion, which I'm sure working in archives is something that you have to be aware of anyways. But the prevalence of AI tools has the risk of reinforcing and perpetuating those skewed interpretations of history when they're trained on maybe incomplete data, or the majority narrative that's been passed down and they don't have some of those lesser represented voices, it can sound more like an official voice and authority on a particular subject. So I could see where in the archives in particular, that could be something that will be even more important for you guys to critically examine. Where our question before was about authorship, and now I can't look at it, but
Let me go back.
no, it's okay. I just could see where historical inequities and critical stewardship are going to be even more prevalent, and needing a human to then interpret and give a bit of a more nuanced view of history.
And to Amy's point, and related to research as well, even tools that as academic librarians we look into and sometimes recommend with a caution, consensus or research rabbit, they're generally going to be pulling from like the consensus. They will not put the outliers. Generally, you won't see many of the outliers into what is being generated in those particular research AI tools. And just because someone is an outlier does not necessarily mean they're wrong. So that goes to distorted narratives as well. Did I blow up the system?
Is it frozen?
Oh, okay. I didn't know. I didn't know if you want to say something. Sorry. You see the next slide?
Yeah.
Okay.
So system level costs, the functionality of AI technologies, building, training those data centers, ensuring more accuracy, and evaluating the environmental footprint of this infrastructure, as well as continuing to examine more sustainable practices that mitigate harm and fostering innovation in academic and archival work.
All right. This is the third part and last part probably. Stewardship and long-term responsibility. As Amy pointed out, energy use is measurable, but as I discussed earlier, authorship it can certainly be messier. If AI helps shape a work, we don't get to pretend it didn't. Someone signs off at some point. Someone still represents the institution for the work that's being presented, being the output. Someone obviously still owns the outcome. If something was found to be false, or if something would, I'm assuming you all are aware of hallucinations. Basically AI. I had it explained to me by I don't know. He's head of the online learning for the state of North Carolina. It generates these hallucinations for articles, and students are prone to it because it wants to provide something for you. It's like it wants to be helpful. So that's why we end up with these hallucinations. So if an article that you cite doesn't exist, that's a problem. Even if there's one that's somewhat like it may be even written by the same person, that's a problem. And an English first year writing professor last semester, I guess she was telling her students to use AI to get citations. And maybe it was a greater experiment. I didn't hear anybody else basically come into contact with it. I had a student that said, I need you to help me find these articles. And 6 out of the 7 didn't exist. And then the 7th didn't have the proper citation. So that was a little worrying. But anyway,
that's what we come across most often is students asking us to find things that don't exist. But it is interesting that they don't work great in finding articles, and they don't work great in doing citations, even though those are kind of formulaic. So you would think, but
But yeah, at the end of the day, someone signs off, someone's responsible, but and that responsibility doesn't expire. And that gets to a bit to stewardship. I think it certainly suggests it. So you might know these as different terms. I'll show those in a moment. Hopefully I've got the understandings correctly, but that's the way I understood them anyway. But authenticity and privacy, things that people should consider. Um, uh, who shaped the work? How was it made? Who might be exposed? So these questions aren't just archival questions, but they certainly could be in certain circumstances. They're questions that show up though, basically in anywhere in institutions that are producing or managing information. Archivists probably tend to see them earlier and more clearly than the rest of us. But we talked about authorship and intellectual agency earlier, but this is where the idea shows up in practice. If AI helps produce something that doesn't influence that influence doesn't disappear. It's still there. It remains there. Someone still, again, approves it. Someone still represents it from the institution. So, as professionals, can we be clear about what shaped the work? That phrasing can remind us of the earlier section. I think, can we explain how it was made? That's a big thing. Tools influence drafts, summaries, and decisions. Most professional work has layers to it. We do drafts, we do edits, we do systems. That's the system tools don't really change that. They just kind of make it go faster. It adds another layer to it. And so the issue isn't, again, I guess I'm just I'm saying AI isn't responsible for anything, but it's just like any other tool. And ultimately, the responsibility lies with us. It isn't whether the tools are used; it's whether we can explain the process if someone asks. And then finally, who might be exposed? What data moves and what leaves our control? That's something that is a large question. It matters a lot in most fields. I think of it in the medical field. I think of anecdotally, I had a colleague tell me that she was speaking to a professor who basically uploaded student papers into an AI. And there are different levels of how that could be bad, but it's certainly an invasion of privacy. I guess you could say if he took papers off, that might be different, but it leads to some pretty big questions, and they can apply to multiple fields. Authenticity, that first one, going back, who shaped the work? Authenticity, that's something you all look at. In this particular case, I'll show some examples of how it works, could work related to a student, some things that should be in the gray area. Not clearly doing the unethical thing, not clearly doing the ethical thing. And then I'll kind of leave you all to relate it to your particular profession. A student asks an AI system whether their argument is convincing and receives several alternative interpretations. What would you think about that? Is that ethical or related to authenticity? It just depends on how they use it. If they use those I would think the part where it identifies whether their argument is convincing. I personally wouldn't see that as being unethical. But then if you receive several alternative interpretations and you incorporate those, then it gets a little bit more gray area. The professor is a researcher. Researcher uses AI to generate preliminary literature synthesis to identify themes before reading the full articles. Again, gray area, I think. It depends on the follow-up there, I would think, but it is certainly something that would go, again, to authenticity. So you would kind of have to think about it as an archivist, how that would apply to you related to AI. Provenance, the second point there. Student asks an AI system to suggest ways to organize the paper after completing the research. Is that ethical? Is it not? Professor is researcher. A researcher asks AI to summarize dozens of papers while preparing the background section of a grant proposal. I like this particular idea just because it's not necessarily something that you spend years of your life on. People that are doing article research, book research, they have a lot more invested with that. They're more likely to be haphazard, I would think, with a grant proposal, even though it is pretty important. And I think in many cases, academics might actually admit that they would do something like this, more likely do it in that particular situation. But again, how would it apply to provenance as an archivist is a question you might ask yourself. And then finally, privacy. A student uploads a draft of their paper to an AI tool to receive detailed feedback before submitting it. Is it ethical? Is it not related to privacy? One thing to keep in mind there are there different levels of it. If you're using a free AI, then what you're putting in there becomes the product of the AI. That's not necessarily the case if you're paying for it. They still keep logs for a certain amount of time, but they do disappear. Whereas if you're putting it in there into a free tool, it's free use then. There actually have been people fired. I can't remember the big example, but there have been people fired for work that they've done for a company. And as soon as the AI gets it, is now a property of the AI company and basically anyone that asks about it. So that's certainly a privacy issue. Professor is a researcher pastes interview excerpts into an AI system to help identify themes in qualitative data. I guess, again, it would have to be, it could go into what details the person's given, whether their name's given in there as to whether it's ethical or unethical, but it's certainly something we would have to concern. What you put in there is not yours necessarily any longer. And again, particularly if you're using a free version. So as an archivist, that's something you might consider too. You're talking about descriptions. I've used it for alternative text to be ADA accessible. I'm not greatest at writing short descriptions. As you can tell by the way I talk, I like to go on a bit. So it will help me write succinct descriptions, but I don't know how much privacy comes into that. But if you're having people's materials, that's certainly something that you would have to be cognizant of. So, shaping the record that remains. This isn't just professional theory. This whole slide is a reality that every AI-assisted choice we make in every profession becomes part of the record others will have to navigate. We are not just the users of a tool. We are the architects of the result that remains. We are shaping the record that others will inherit. Hopefully, as archivists, that will speak to you a bit. And that's what we have. Anything else you want to say, Amy?
No. We just wanted to share some of the things that we thought might be most applicable to you guys and what we've seen, and hopefully raise some thought and consideration at least.
We're open to questions. Well, we didn't put it on the slide, but we're certainly open to questions.
Thank you guys so much. This was absolutely wonderful. Yes, please drop your questions in the chat, or feel free to unmute as well if you have questions. You guys presented a lot of really great information to think about, and I think a lot of, even though you guys not being archivists, a lot of what you guys talked about is very, very relevant to the work that is being done by archivists and discussions that are happening in the field right now as far as the ethical use of AI. Because I know you guys mentioned kind of creating collection guides. That's something that is very transferable to what archivists do. And then even your last example that you just gave of, a researcher taking excerpts from an interview and putting them through AI. I know us here at ECU and a lot of other archival repositories put, oral histories online for people to be able to use. So this is something that could very much so happen. And it is something to consider moving forward. And it's still, it's kind of crazy to think that it's only been, very prominent for a handful of years now, but it's becoming something that's very unavoidable, I think. And something that it's probably a disservice to ourselves at this point to not educate ourselves on, since it's going to become more of a, prevalent thing. So thank you guys. I feel like the information you guys presented is very, very helpful.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity. One thing to your point, I will say that maybe it's just because I have a strong Beaufort County, North Carolina accent. If you're doing oral histories, the AI, when I'm using the voice, does not always understand what I'm saying. I mean, obviously, ChatGPT does a bit better than Siri does, but a lot of times it totally does not get my point. So that could be something that would come into effect with something like oral history if you're trying to use it.
Yeah. Well, I know a lot of institutions, I know, again, we do it here at ECU, where we do use AI to help with transcriptions for oral histories, but that's we use Otter AI here, but it's definitely something where we have it's a big project that we always have our student employees do, where they go through and clean it up basically, because there are a lot of, whether it's, especially people from North Carolina and the South, there's so many words that AI doesn't quite catch because of our accents and everything. So yeah, I mean, it's a very, AI can be very helpful. But I always try and remind students that it's not a replacement either. And it sounds like you guys have run into that a lot as well.
Yeah, it's a tool like a calculator. And
Yeah.
calculators met resistance from math professors at one point too. And again, it's all in how you're using it.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Does anybody have any questions? All right, well, I will go ahead. I'm going to stop our recording.